The call came in just after breakfast. Two officers stood at my front gate, polite but firm, hands resting on their belts. According to the HOA, I was unlawfully denying community access to the neighborhood pool. The complaint came from Karen, of course, who insisted the pool was shared property and that my refusal was grounds for police involvement. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked if they had a warrant. They didn't. Asked if there was an active emergency. There wasn't. Karen, watching from across the street, folded her arms with the confidence of someone who thought badges meant instant obedience. The pool sat behind my home, fenced, gated, and very clearly attached to my parcel. It had been there before the HOA existed. The original builder installed it as part of a private amenities agreement, something most residents never bothered to read. Over the years, Karen treated it like a community perk, handing out guest permissions and scolding anyone who questioned her authority. I calmly told the officers I would retrieve documentation. While they waited, I walked inside and opened a folder I'd kept untouched for years. Inside were plats, easements, insurance riders, and one very specific addendum stamped by the county. It outlined liability, access, and control of the pool. Ownership rested solely with me, and any use by non-owners required written permission. No permission, no access. Simple. When I returned, I handed copies through the gate. The officers read quietly. Their posture shifted. Karen's smile didn't. She began explaining, loudly, that the HOA always used it. One officer finally looked up.
"Usage isn't ownership," he said.
His tone was neutral, final. Karen froze. She tried to pivot, accusing me of being unneighborly, of hoarding resources. That was when I told her there was more she should know. What Karen didn't realize was that the pool wasn't just private. It was insured, inspected, and regulated under a separate agreement tied to my professional operations. The access rules weren't optional. Violations triggered penalties, audits, and automatic fee adjustments for any entity attempting unauthorized control. The officers thanked me and left. Karen stayed. She demanded to know what I meant. I told her calmly that calling the cops had activated a review process she couldn't stop. And once it finished, the HOA would be paying for it. She laughed. She shouldn't have. Backhand index pointing right before we continue. Make sure you subscribe because what happens next exposes exactly how expensive HOA overreach can become, especially when paperwork is involved. That afternoon, notices went out automatically, triggered by the compliance flag Karen unknowingly tripped. Emails landed in inboxes across the subdivision, dryly worded, officially titled, and impossible to ignore. An external administrator was assigned. Access logs were requested. Fee structures were reviewed. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just systems doing exactly what they were designed to do when someone pushed too hard. By sunset, Karen had stopped pacing. By nightfall, the HOA portal went into maintenance mode. The pool lights reflected quietly on still water, untouched, unquestioned, waiting for the next move. I locked the gate, filed the last form, and slept easily, knowing the story was only beginning and that this time the rules were on my side, documented, stamped, and very patient. Morning would bring meetings, explanations, and numbers Karen never expected to see. But that reckoning belonged to the next chapter, after everyone understood one simple truth. When you summon authority without understanding jurisdiction, you often invite consequences that don't leave when the sirens stop, and they always arrive fully itemized, contractually sound, and completely unavoidable. The next morning, the HOA office looked like it had been hit by a quiet storm. No shouting, no flashing lights, just phones ringing nonstop and emails stacking up faster than anyone could answer them. Karen arrived early, coffee in hand, ready to manage the situation. By the time she logged into the HOA system, she realized she couldn't. Access denied. The compliance flag she had triggered the day before wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. When an HOA attempts to assert control over a privately owned, insured, and regulated facility without jurisdiction, the system doesn't ask questions, it escalates. Automatically. The HOA's management software had frozen financial actions pending review. No new fines. No rule changes. No access authorizations. Karen called the property management company first. They didn't answer. She called again. Voicemail. When she finally reached a junior administrator, the response was calm but devastating. An external compliance administrator had been assigned overnight, as required by the pool's governing agreement. Until the review concluded, the HOA's authority over anything even tangentially related to the pool was suspended. That included fees, amenities listings, and enforcement actions. At 10 sharp, the first official notice went out to homeowners. Subject line: Administrative Review of HOA Authority and Asset Listings. Dry language. Legal tone. No blame. Just facts. The pool, long advertised as a community amenity, was under review for misrepresentation. Any homeowner who had paid dues under the assumption of guaranteed access was invited to submit documentation. That's when the question started. Residents knocked on Karen's door, figuratively and literally. Some were confused. Others were upset. A few were furious. They wanted to know why something they'd been paying for might not actually belong to the HOA. Karen tried to reassure them, repeating the same phrases she always had. It's always been this way. Everyone uses it. This is just a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't trigger audits. By noon, the external administrator introduced himself via email.
Polite.
Precise. He requested marketing materials, HOA newsletters, website screenshots, and any documents where the pool was described as a shared amenity. He also requested financial records going back 7 years, specifically fee calculations tied to recreational access. Karen's hands shook as she printed the email. The board convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. For once, Karen wasn't in charge. The administrator chaired it remotely.
Cameras on.
Recording enabled. Every statement mattered. When Karen explained that the pool was functionally communal, he asked a single question. Do you have written authorization? Silence. One board member tried to argue intent. Another mentioned tradition. The administrator nodded, typed notes, and moved on. Intent and tradition don't appear in contracts. Authorization does. By the end of the meeting, the reality was unavoidable. The HOA had been representing a private asset as a community benefit without legal standing. That exposure came with consequences: reassessed fees, potential refunds, updated disclosures, and administrative penalties. Karen finally asked the question she should have asked days earlier. What happens next? The administrator answered calmly. First, a full accounting. Then, a correction. Any value attributed to the pool would be recalculated and reassigned. If homeowners had been paying for access they never legally had, that imbalance would be corrected, one way or another. Karen looked at the screen, then at the other board members. No one met her eyes. Because everyone in that room understood the same thing at the same time. Calling the cops hadn't asserted authority. It had summoned scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't leave quietly. Within 48 hours, the review moved from uncomfortable to undeniable. The external administrator's requests weren't slowing down. They were expanding. What began as a pool access issue had grown into a broader examination of how the HOA defined, advertised, and enforced its authority. Homeowners started comparing notes. Some dug through old welcome packets and realized the pool had been marketed as included. Others remembered paying higher dues specifically because of exclusive amenities. Screenshots surfaced. Archived web pages were recovered. Flyers from years ago quietly contradicted everything Karen was now claiming. The administrator noticed. A second notice went out, this time more direct. The HOA was instructed to cease referring to the pool as a community amenity immediately. All signage, digital listings, and printed materials had to be corrected within 72 hours. Failure to comply would trigger penalties tied to misrepresentation. That's when the board's tone shifted from defensive to panicked. Karen tried to control the narrative. She sent an email to residents framing the situation as a temporary administrative clarification. She emphasized unity, patience, and cooperation. What she didn't include was the growing list of liabilities now sitting on the HOA's desk. Residents weren't fooled. Questions poured in. Why were dues calculated the way they were? Why hadn't ownership ever been disclosed clearly? Why was the pool locked behind private insurance if it was truly communal? Each question chipped away at the image Karen had built for years, that of someone who knew what she was doing. Behind the scenes, the financial implications were becoming impossible to ignore. The administrator's preliminary assessment showed that a portion of HOA fees had been unjustifiably allocated based on access to a facility the HOA didn't own. That meant reassessments, possibly refunds, possibly adjustments going forward. And someone would be responsible for authorizing all of it. The board met again, this time without Karen leading. One member suggested legal counsel. Another suggested a settlement. A third quietly asked whether the HOA insurance even covered administrative misrepresentation. No one answered. Karen finally confronted me directly, this time without an audience. She demanded to know why I hadn't just explained everything before calling this in. I reminded her that I hadn't called anyone. She had. And that documentation had always been available. She'd simply chosen not to read it. She accused me of setting a trap. I told her the truth. There was no trap. Just boundaries. Boundaries she'd crossed repeatedly, assuming no one would stop her. The pool was private. The rules were clear. The consequences were automatic. That's what happens when systems are built properly. By the end of the week, the HOA's finances were officially under review. Certain fees were frozen. Others flagged for recalculation. The pool, once a symbol of community prestige, was now a liability line item with footnotes and warnings attached. Residents noticed Karen's change in demeanor. She stopped issuing warnings, stopped sending mass emails, stopped correcting people. At meetings, she spoke less and listened more. When she did speak, she deferred to the administrator, careful not to overstep. The authority she once wielded so casually had evaporated, not because someone took it from her, but because it had never truly existed. The pool gate remained closed. Quiet, undisturbed, not as a show of power, but as a reminder. Ownership isn't loud. It doesn't call the cops. It doesn't threaten. It waits. And when challenged improperly, it responds exactly as written. The HOA was learning that lesson in real time. And Karen, for the first time, understood that calling an authority without jurisdiction doesn't end disputes. It multiplies them. By the start of the following week, the HOA was operating under a completely different reality. The external administrator had moved from review to correction, and that distinction mattered. Reviews ask questions. Corrections make changes. The first correction was structural. The HOA's authority over amenities was formally redefined. Anything not explicitly owned, insured, and maintained by the HOA was removed from enforcement language. That meant no rules, no fines, no permissions, and no assumptions. The pool was listed clearly and publicly as a private facility with no implied community access. That single line changed everything. Homeowners who had once treated the pool as a given now understood it as something separate, something they had been benefiting from indirectly, without realizing it. The administrator's report showed how often the pool had been referenced in valuation discussions, resale comparisons, and fee justifications. Even without access, its presence had inflated desirability. That value had been quietly folded into HOA calculations for years. And now it had to be untangled. Financial recalibration notices went out next. Portions of HOA dues were flagged for adjustment, with explanations attached. No drama, no blame, just math. Where value had been assumed, it was removed. Where fees had been justified improperly, they were corrected. It wasn't punitive. It was precise. Karen struggled most with the loss of narrative control. She could no longer frame issues emotionally or steer conversations away from documentation. Every question now had an answer, or an admission that one didn't exist. The board deferred constantly to the administrator, who spoke in neutral language that left no room for interpretation. At one meeting, Karen attempted to argue that community harmony should outweigh technicalities. The administrator responded politely, then displayed a slide showing liability exposure if unauthorized access had ever resulted in injury. The room went quiet. Harmony doesn't cover lawsuits. From that point on, resistance faded. The HOA updated its website. Old photos were replaced. Descriptions rewritten. Even the welcome packet for new residents was redesigned, stripping out references that could be misconstrued. What remained was simpler, cleaner, and legally accurate. Residents adjusted quickly. Some apologized quietly. Others thanked me for holding the line, even if it came with inconvenience. A few admitted they'd always assumed the pool wasn't really communal, but had enjoyed pretending otherwise. Assumptions, it turned out, were expensive. Karen became careful. Very careful. She stopped initiating actions and started asking for approvals. She no longer spoke in absolutes. Her emails were shorter, more cautious, often copied to legal counsel. The confidence she once projected had been replaced with restraint. The pool itself remained unchanged.
Clean. Secure.
Peaceful. It didn't need to be used to prove a point. Its role had already shifted from a perceived entitlement to a documented boundary. By midweek, the administrators scheduled the final phase, reconciliation and closure. Once complete, the HOA would regain operational control within its proper limits. Karen would retain her seat, but not her unchecked influence. The lesson had settled in. When you call authority into a situation you don't fully understand, you don't get to choose how deep it looks. And once the review starts, everything connected to the overreach gets examined. The HOA had called the cops over pool access. What they got instead was a mirror. By the time the administrator issued the final report, the neighborhood felt quieter, not calmer, but more aware. The kind of quiet that comes after assumptions are stripped away and replaced with facts. The HOA regained control of its operations, but only within the narrow boundaries clearly outlined in writing. No gray areas. No implied authority. No shortcuts. The pool was no longer mentioned in HOA meetings unless legally necessary. Its status was settled, recorded, and acknowledged. Private. Controlled. Off limits, without permission. Not as punishment, not as leverage, just as reality. What had once been treated like a community entitlement was now understood as a separate asset, governed by rules that didn't bend for convenience or familiarity. Karen attended the final meeting in person. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was careful, procedural, and noticeably restrained. The board approved the administrator's recommendations unanimously. Corrected disclosures. Updated financial models. Revised enforcement language. Every change was documented and distributed to homeowners. There were no apologies on the record. None were required. The outcome spoke for itself. Homeowners adapted quickly. Conversations shifted from complaints to clarity. People asked better questions. They requested copies of covenants before agreeing to anything. They paid closer attention to where authority actually came from. The HOA, once a source of irritation and confusion, became something closer to what it was supposed to be, an administrative body, not a governing force. A few residents reached out privately. Some thanked me for holding firm. Others admitted they'd always been uneasy about how casually Karen enforced rules. One said something that stuck with me. I didn't realize how much we were relying on assumptions until they were taken away. Neither had Karen. The pool gate stayed locked that evening as I walked the perimeter, checking nothing more than water levels and lighting. Everything was as it had always been, peaceful, contained, mine. But the difference now was understanding. No one questioned why the gate was locked. No one asked for exceptions. The rules were no longer personal. They were clear. Karen never called the police again. Not on me. Not on anyone else for things she didn't fully control. The lesson had landed, not with force, but with process. Authority had been tested, measured, and corrected. Calling the cops hadn't strengthened her position. It had exposed it. And once exposed, it couldn't be rebuilt the way it was before. Because power that relies on assumption doesn't survive documentation. And boundaries, once written, don't need to be defended loudly. They just need to exist, quietly, patiently, and exactly as recorded.